Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the summit.
Well, Senator Cotton, thank you very much for joining us. Thank all of you for coming out here today. It's a great honor to have a chance to go talk to you. Let's dispense quickly and early on with what my late colleague Bill Sapphire used to call the great mentioner, a portion of presidencies, which are always a little bit hard to go take. But tell us, if you can, what, if anything, you have heard from President-elect Trump's office, and whether Secretary of Defense is even something you're interested in.
David, it's good to be here with you, and I want to thank Defense One for hosting us this morning and hosting this full day of events. President-elect Trump will make these decisions in his own due time, and he'll make those decisions to what's best for his administration and best for the country. I think we should let him take that time. Most new presidents-elect haven't made major cabinet decisions until after Thanksgiving anyway, so there's many days ahead of us, and I think it's best to just wait until he makes those decisions.
So you think everybody should relax and take Thanksgiving off? Is that basically?
Everybody should enjoy a happy Thanksgiving with family, yeah.
Great. Well, let's go right into the first topic. So yesterday you gave a speech on the Senate floor, and you talked about a $26 billion supplemental for continuing operations and a series of other capital expenses that you think the Pentagon needs. I guess you wouldn't probably take a vote on this until next year. Tell us what problem you think this would begin to solve, and I think that'll take us into some discussion of the defense budget.
To look at the problem broadly, you have to look at the last 8 years of neglect of our military. By some measures, we've had over $1 trillion in cuts to our defense budget, and we're to the point now where we face real problems with readiness of operations overseas, and that leads to problems back here in the States when it comes to training in terms of man hours, equipment, and so forth. And there's a degree of which we've cannibalized future modernization to pay for readiness and pay for current operations, our own locust years, if you could put it that way. So this $26.4 billion emergency supplemental bill that I announced yesterday that I'll introduce early next year, and hopefully we could pass it early, would be something of a down payment for the remainder of this fiscal year. It would have three major elements. It would fund overseas operations in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. The President himself just submitted a supplemental request. I think it was about $5.8 billion for defense operations. Second, it would be a down payment on readiness, on getting the flight hours that our pilots need, on getting the live fire exercises that our Marines and our soldiers need, on doing operations and maintenance on aircraft and ships and so forth. And then third, it would simply fund the outstanding unfunded requirements list from the service chiefs that they submitted earlier this year. So buying the F-35s that they said they would have liked to buy, or buying the Apaches and the Chinooks that they would have liked to have bought if OMB hadn't taken a pencil to their budget. That's not going to solve our long-term defense problem by any means. Donald Trump knows that. He gave a major speech on this topic in September about repealing the defense sequester and building up our Navy to 350 ships and 1,200 fighters and an end strength of the Army of 540,000 soldiers. But I hope it will stop the hemorrhaging in the short term, give our war fighters overseas the resources they need to continue that fight, those who are here getting ready to go downrange, the training they need, and allow us the time and the breathing space for a long-term rebuilding of our military, which is what really needs to happen.
So you mentioned the $1 trillion cut, although it's a cut from a high from when we were obviously more engaged in two active wars than we are today. But a lot of that cut was from the sequester, which your own party was voting for and pushing. So tell me a little bit about your conversations just among your own caucus on this subject.
Well, I announced my campaign for Congress 5 years ago, right after the Budget Control Act passed. In part, I said I wouldn't have voted for the Budget Control Act because it treated defense spending just like non-defense spending. The high coming out of the Bush era, though, was something of a misleading high because so much of that money was spent on wartime operations
Right.
in Iraq and Afghanistan. So much of it was spent on urgent operational needs, the kind of things that Don Rumsfeld and then especially Bob Gates pushed through very rapidly to meet critical warfighter needs like the MRAP or like additional UAV investments. So you didn't see the base budget of the Department of Defense being rebuilt with the long-term capital investment strategy that it really needed. And then you had a cut off of that somewhat, that wartime focused high. Within our own party, we have some budget hawks, we have some defense hawks, but I personally believe that national security is the first priority of the federal government. It's the one thing in which the strategy and the threat has to drive the budget. The budget can't drive the strategy and doesn't determine the threats because our adversaries get a say in it. We have a lot of other important priorities on when it comes to domestic policy, but in those areas sometimes the budget has to drive the strategy. But in national security, fundamentally, the strategy and the threats that we face has to drive our budget. And if you go back and you look at what the National Defense Panel did 2 years ago, starting with the Bob Gates baseline budget of FY 2011, he had said, I think this year the number would have been somewhere around 620, maybe 640, substantially lower than that now. And that was, the reason they use that as a baseline is twofold. One, that was the last budget in which the Pentagon did a full planning cycle before the Budget Control Act and sequester. So it's the last budget in which the strategy and the threats really drove the needs. And two, Bob Gates had been very aggressive in cutting unneeded programs and platforms from the military in the preceding 2 years of the Obama administration. And third, I would add, the world's gotten a lot more dangerous in the last 5 years. So I hope the Pentagon will be allowed to go forward with a full planning cycle that doesn't have to take into account the threat of sequester and present the Congress the budget that they need to rebuild our military capabilities and capacity because that's what the Congress hasn't done for too long.
When Secretary Gates was doing that cutting of unnecessary programs, and when you go through his memoirs, he makes it pretty clear there were many more things he wanted to cut that simply he could not get through because they were systems built in somebody's district or many people's districts. His guiding philosophy was you're not going to get support for building into the military budget unless you're willing to cut out systems that we no longer need. First, do you agree with that? And secondly, what's on your list of things that you think in order to do what you believe needs to be done, we can get rid of?
Well, I agree with Bob Gates on most things, and he's right that our military needs to be investing in the systems that we need to keep our country safe from the threats we face today and to prepare for the threats tomorrow. And that's a lot of what he had focused on when he was Secretary of Defense, is eliminating some of the systems that he didn't think were necessary or that were a lower priority at a time when we were fighting two very large, hot wars. Now, he was double-crossed, unfortunately, by the President and Jack Lew. They had promised him that he could take that savings that he had found in the department and plow it back into future systems. Unfortunately, they just took it for other fiscal purposes. In terms of systems, platforms that I would eliminate, I have to say Bob Gates probably did most of those himself. There's not a lot of fat left in the Department of Defense budget when you look at big platforms. Mm-hmm. In fact, we're much more likely to need to increase our investment in things like the long-range strike bomber or the Ohio-class replacement, the F-35 or so forth. Now, there are some things that can be changed. I've on the Armed Services Committee, I've pushed the Army to look at using commercial off-the-shelf solutions for some of its intelligence systems. That's important. I think that'll be good for our warfighters, some of whom are already using these systems in hasty fashions. It's also good for our taxpayers because it'll save them money in the long run. That's more a matter, though, of sound procurement practice, in my opinion, than it is major systems that need to be canceled.
Let's talk for a moment about a topic I know you've been very interested in, which is nuclear modernization. When you look at some of the big bills coming out over the next 10 years, it's the step that comes after the investments that have been made in the Obama administration in trying to revitalize the actual nuclear weapons. But we have a series of extremely expensive delivery systems that are up there. You mentioned Ohio class, but our land-based systems, our bombers, President-elect Trump noted many times, are wildly outdated. And then, of course, the submarine system. And if you add all these together, you're talking $1 trillion over the next quarter century, which, you know, even by Washington standards, actually turns into real money. First of all, do you believe we have to go full out with that program? And secondly, do you really believe that we need all three legs of the triad?
So absolutely, we need all three legs of the triad, and we need to fully modernize the triad as well as the weapons and the command and control system. Maybe if I could amend my previous answer about eliminating major systems, maybe we could eliminate the B-52 and just get enough B-21s to replace it, since the B-52 has been around since my grandfather was of fighting age. Look, our nuclear enterprise is not always the most popular thing. It's something that a lot of people would rather not have to think about, but there has not been great power conflict in the world for 70 years. I would submit that that's not a coincidence, given that we lived in the nuclear age for the last 70 years, that it's been a critical component of trying to keep world peace. Yes, there have been terrible wars, and people have lost their lives, but nothing like we saw in the first half of the 20th century. Some people say that, you know, we shouldn't spend so much money on weapons we never use. I would say they're wrong on both counts. We don't spend that much money on our nuclear enterprise. It's less than 5% of our total defense spend. It is going to be.
But if you do have to do this,
it's going to be expensive. But you know,
If
you stretch something over 25 or 30 years, for anything in our military, the bill adds up pretty quickly. So people are wrong if they say we spend a lot of money on it. Two, they're also wrong to say we never use them. We use our nuclear weapons every day. We use them to deter conflict with great powers. Some people say it's a Cold War mentality to think that we have to fully rebuild our enterprise and the whole triad. I would submit that it's a Cold War mentality to simply look at what the United States and Russia have done. China is modernizing and expanding its nuclear forces. North Korea is doing so very rapidly. You have other countries that are now nuclear as well, and Iran is, in my opinion, still on the path to get nuclear weapons. So it would be a Cold War mentality to simply look at the United States and Russia and try to build our nuclear enterprises to match Russia. Now, in terms of the triad, most people would say, like when they talk about what can be eliminated, they look at the land forces, the ICBMs. I think that would be short-sighted because our submarines can always be sunk, our bombers can always be attacked. And our ICBMs are a huge advantage when you look at countries like Russia and China and the kind of weapons they would have to neutralize our missiles. They help provide a degree of balance across the triad and deterrence to countries like China, like Russia.
You don't worry that they're a big fat target in the middle of the country that is hard to defend, and that, as we've seen, has been the one that's run into the most both morale and operational problems?
Well, in principle, yes, they're hard to defend because they're stable, unlike some countries that use rail and road. But in practice, the number of incoming missiles and the degree of targeting that would take to fully neutralize them is something that I think gives us a decisive advantage against Russia and against China.
I want to run through three adversaries that we need to talk about a little bit. You mentioned in your last sentence Russia, so let's start with that. We've heard the President-elect talk about an entirely new relationship. That doesn't sit well with some members of your party. Lindsey Graham wants to hold hearings on the hacking that preceded the election. We're seeing harassment of NATO allies. We're seeing post-Crimea, continued harassment in military activity in Ukraine. So first off, would you be in favor, in the name of improving relations with the Russians, of lifting the Ukraine sanctions?
Well, to improve our relations with Russia, what needs to happen foremost is that Vladimir Putin has to have a new sense of boundaries. I know that some people disagree with Donald Trump's words, but it's Barack Obama's actions and policies that have allowed Vladimir Putin to achieve so many of his national objectives. I mean, it was.
So you think President Trump will set boundaries?
I believe that Donald Trump will not be viewed, not just by Vladimir Putin, but by many of our other adversaries' leaders, as someone who is going to take a tougher line and defend America's core interests in a way that Barack Obama has not. I mean, remember, it was Barack Obama who pushed for the Russian reset. It was Barack Obama who told Dmitry Medvedev in a setting like this, when he thought the microphone was turned off, that he'd have a lot more flexibility after his reelection.
But the Russian reset, how does that differ from what we're hearing from President-elect Trump?
So it would be good, of course, if we had a better relationship with most of our adversaries. But to have that better relationship, particularly with Russia, they have to have a new set of boundaries. They have to recognize that we are going to stand by our alliance structures, that we are going to support the countries that support us. They have to understand that organizations like NATO are not a threat to Russia. Look at the force structure, look at the capabilities, look at the deployments that we have in NATO. None of those are offensive capabilities that are designed, that are targeted against Russia. They have to have Vladimir Putin needs to have a sense of boundaries, but he also needs to have a sense of reality of what we are trying to achieve in our national objectives and what our European allies are trying to achieve.
So when you say we have to stand by our alliance structures, it was in the July interview that my colleague Maggie Haberman and I did with then candidate Trump, in which he said, if attacked by Russia, he would go to the Baltic members of NATO and check what their contributions to NATO have been before he came to their defense. That was not considered by some to be a rousing reassurance of our willingness to defend our NATO allies. Do we need to move away from that kind of approach?
Well, the best way to deter that kind of conflict from happening, the best way to stop seeing in, say, Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania, what you've seen in Georgia or Moldova or Ukraine, is to be ironclad in our support of our NATO allies. That's one of the things I mean when I say that we need to give Vladimir Putin a new sense
without
of
a
boundaries.
contributions test, then?
Well, Article 5 is a treaty commitment. The 2% defense spend is a political commitment. There's a difference between those two. It would be a good thing if all of our European allies were spending more than 2% on defense, because many of them have let their defense capabilities and capacities wither over the last 25 years. And many of these countries either are, like Estonia, or they are preparing they're on the path in the next 2 to 3 years to do so. Now look, our NATO allies are never going to be able to have the kind of military we do. We have a $19 trillion economy. But because of their locations, because of their histories, because of their accesses, they can provide us things that we can't do for ourselves. You know, take a country like Norway. I mean, Norway does for the United States things that no other country in the world can do. That helps us. That's why we're in NATO. NATO is not a charity. We're not a member of NATO out of humanitarian impulse. We are in NATO because it's a security alliance that protects our interests. And, you know, when I was in Latvia a couple months ago, I visited with our troops around in the front with Latvian troops as part of the European Reassurance Initiative. It's disappointing to me that our allies need to be reassured after 8 years of the Obama administration.
But I think what I'm hearing from you, Senator, is a more traditional sense of our alliances in which we get a good deal out of, for our national interests, out of being forward deployed, having allies like Norway, given their geographic position and their willingness to help. Same thing you might say of Japan and South Korea. What I thought I heard from the president-elect was a much more transactional kind of discussion, that we would measure these alliances by their individual contributions. Certainly it'll be a topic when Prime Minister Abe comes to see the president-elect today in New York. Do I have that difference right? Are you sort of more in the traditional alliances category?
I'll let you characterize both the president-elect and me and my views. I'll just characterize my views.
Okay, great.
But I mean, Donald Trump has spoken about upholding our obligations and our alliances as part of our core interests. You know, the military does humanitarian work, of course. I mean, we've done it in Japan after the earthquake and tsunami, in Nepal or Bhutan. But the military's core job is to protect our security interests. And one way we do that is with our alliance structure. And we can't be as safe in America without those alliance structures. That's why we've had them for so long. And Donald Trump has acknowledged the importance of those alliances.
Let's turn to Iran. I think it's a fair assessment that you are not a deep admirer of the Iran deal.
Well, I'm not a
along the
deep
way.
admirer of the Ayatollahs either.
Right.
They have the blood. They have the blood of over 500 American soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan on their hands. I once had to tell my soldiers that they should trust their armor, and they asked me what about if they hit an EFP, an explosively formed projectile, and I just said, well, I guess that'll be our day to die then. So I'm not a big fan of Iran or the Ayatollahs.
If you were advising the new administration about how to handle the Iran deal, because they're inheriting it as a done deal. The Iranians in January shipped 98% of their fissile material out of the country. They took all the steps they were required to take, by and large, within the four corners of the agreement, after many had predicted that they would not. So given that, would you advise scrapping the deal?
Well, I would advise Donald Trump to do exactly what he said in a considered, deliberate speech at AIPAC, which is to dismantle that disastrous deal. They aren't upholding their obligations under it. I mean, the Obama administration just acknowledged that last week and downplayed their violations. But the very fact that you could argue that, yes, they're upholding most of their obligations just goes to show how bad that deal was to begin with. For years, our position was Iran had no right to enrich uranium, or for that matter, to perfect the enrichment cycle using other kinds of isotopes, yet they're allowed to do that. Just one example of how limited that deal was. A second example of it is the deal touched on nothing related to Iran's malign non-nuclear behaviors, its violation of UN Security Council resolutions, testing ballistic missiles, its support for terrorist organizations, and so forth. So I think the United States would be much safer if President-elect Trump unwinds that deal. That said, you're right that unfortunately it was structured in a way that gave Iran a lot of the benefit up front, and the United States and our Western allies don't get much benefit up front.
Well, one of the benefits,
they still have a lot of reserves in third country banks. They still need to grow their trade ties, and new sanctions, whether it's under related to the nuclear deal or other malign behaviors, would put a serious damper on that and give us more leverage to get better terms from Iran.
if we unraveled it, they would be free to go resume the production of uranium and plutonium as long as they complied with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, kept the inspectors coming in and so forth. Would you really want to take that risk of giving them an opening? I mean, because right now that activity is pretty well frozen.
Well, we think it is all frozen. I mean, remember, Iran is 2.5 times the size of Texas.
Right.
And what we're talking about hiding could fit in this room. And I mean, the inspectors are, some Scandinavian scientists wandering around the desert with Iranian intelligence officers driving them. Mm-hmm. But that said, even if they're following every single term of the deal, it still expires in all of its main terms in 10 to 15 years, which is now 9 to 14 years.
Right.
And remember, when North Korea signed a deal with the Clinton administration in 1994, a deal that was probably better than the Iran deal from our perspective, it took them only 12 years to test their first nuclear weapon. And now they're in a position to hold at risk American citizens and troops, not just in the Pacific, in places like Guam or Hawaii or Alaska, but in much of the United States mainland. That's the point that so many of us made during the debate. It's not just about the terms of the deal itself and whether Iran will uphold its obligations, but the very fact that you're putting them on the path to nuclear weapons in 10 to 15 years, which is the blink of an eye in the life of a nation.
So glad you raised North Korea.
I mean, Orrin Hatch will still be in the Senate by then, probably.
So glad that you raised North Korea. You said that they can hold at risk the mainland. Maybe you know something we haven't seen so far, but what we've been told publicly anyway is that they're still 4 or 5 years away, by most of the public intelligence estimates, from being able to fashion a nuclear weapon that could fit atop an ICBM that could reach the West Coast. That's still your understanding?
There's too much uncertainty around North Korea's nuclear program and intelligence estimates. Our intelligence professionals are amazing people, but they have a near uniform record on predicting about weapons of mass destruction, they almost always get it wrong.
Right, in one direction or the other.
And that's one direction or the other. They got it wrong in Iraq twice. Once underestimating, once overestimating. That's not because they're bad at their job, they're great at their job. But these countries like Iraq and North Korea, Pakistan, Soviet Union, China, go to extraordinary lengths to conceal what they're doing. If you simply look, though, at the nuclear tests that North Korea has conducted on its own soil, some of the missile or satellite launches it's undertaken, the recent test it's taken from a submarine-launched ballistic missile, then certainly the United States, some parts of North America could be held at risk. And that is not a risk that I think the American people are willing to tolerate.
So let's say that you were advising the next Secretary of Defense who was coming in about how to deal with the North Korea issue. Or let's say you were the next Secretary of Defense trying to deal with this. But in either case, we have had a policy so far that the administration used to call strategic patience, which seemed to be mostly sitting back and hoping that sanctions over time would take their toll. They haven't, by and large, and I think most people in both parties recognize that strategy has failed to stop most of the activities you've been discussing today. How would that change in your best, or how should that change?
So as a matter of defense policy, I think we should rapidly expand our ballistic missile defenses on the West Coast and in the Pacific that could be capable of stopping an attack from a country like North Korea with an arsenal their size. In the long term, we should have the goal of protecting it from a peer competitor, but from North Korea, we should be able to stop. We should have ballistic missile defenses that could stop an attack from North Korea.
So, as you know, ballistic missile defenses are improving, but their hit rate is not fabulous right now. So there are other technologies coming along. You hear a lot about left of launch in the Pentagon. Tell us a little bit about how that might contribute to this.
Well, so I would say that I am confident that we have the ballistic missile defense technology to stop a North Korean attack. I am not as confident that we have the capacity, the sheer volume of it. So that's the first thing I would do. Now, to answer your previous question completely on the foreign policy front, we have to compel China to take a much stronger line on North Korea if the sanctions on North Korea are ever going to work. Now, to get back to your most immediate question and getting left of launch. So without getting too deep into the weeds or sensitive material, obviously once a missile is airborne, it's harder to hit. But the closer you can get to launch or even getting left of launch, whether it's through near-range theater ballistic missiles like the THAAD system or even cyber capabilities, you're going to increase the likelihood that you can stop a catastrophic attack on U.S. citizens.
And that's simply by keeping it from being launched to begin with, right? You mentioned cyber. Tell us a little bit about what you would do to invest in cyber and what you think are the most promising technologies, including offensive technologies like the one you were just referring to.
Well, so I think it is important to distinguish defensive and offensive. There's some debate about creating, or separating the NSA and Cyber Command and whether Cyber Command needs to be, something more like SOCOM. I would say that every service is deeply invested in cyber capabilities and is going to have to remain so, simply to protect its own systems. We don't expect the Marines and the Army to defend air bases. The Air Force has its own personnel to defend those. I think we have to expect and demand that every service develop the cyber capabilities to protect its systems. Now, when you go into offensive capabilities, most of which I won't discuss in this forum, there may be a call for creating something like the Special Operations Command, a functional, non-geographic cross-service command.
Isn't that essentially what Cybercom is today?
Well, but separating it out from the NSA. So you'd have a pure military command and you'd have a pure intelligence agency.
And so your vision for Cyber Command would be make it more like JSOC?
That's a possibility. I don't want to commit to that yet because it's such a fast evolving realm right now. It's something obviously that's been under debate for a while, but it's something that I think right now I'm open-minded to it, but I wouldn't want to commit to it.
How do you assess how well the Obama administration has both invested in cyber and how well it has employed cyber? And I wrote extensively about our activities against Iran, but that's obviously not the limit of it. As you look at it, are we both investing and using them the right way?
We could do more. I'll just leave it at that.
Great. Well, Senator Cotton, thank you. This has been a fascinating half hour. You've really covered the breadth of the waterfront here. I look forward to it. We all look forward to seeing what your role will be in the coming year, and I really appreciate you spending the time.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.